Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and what we're going to discuss in this section is Betrayed Brothers, Star Wars in the Jungle, Landscapes of Fear, Collapsing Ceramic Spheres, and the Last Days of Great Cities. We are going to talk about the end of a world, the classic Maya collapse. We're going to follow that outline that's right up above my yellow box, and you will have the last puzzle pieces you need to answer that question on the left. And let's go ahead and get started. From the Epigraphic Record, the following image emerges of sort of classic Maya political landscape. And it's a landscape filled with these autonomous city-states that are locked inside these webs of war and alliance and marriage and hegemony and power relationships. And if you take kind of the whole of Maya political history, I've kind of organized it into, 6 rough sections that I've listed right up above me. That basically have the first few centuries AD, sort of the period of these founder kings. And this is when all of the great royal lines are founded, and these great cities sort of get their origin as the old pre-classic civilization collapses. These new classic cities emerge. And these classic cities do quite well for several centuries. And then there is a heavily debated, poorly understood event at the end of the 4th century in 378, in an event called the Entrada. And it features this individual called Siyakak, he who is born of fire. At any rate, Siyakak may or may not be a foreigner. He is affiliated with this sort of Central Mexican Empire, the Central Mexican Empire of Teotihuacan, and he shows up with all this Teotihuacano imagery. And people don't know if this is just someone using the trappings of Teotihuacan, or if he's a general of Teotihuacan, or they're just sort of emulating foreign influence. It's heavily debated. But what we do know is what comes out of the Entrada, which is a period of the New Order. You have these New Order cities arise in the 4th, 5th, and into the 6th centuries. And the New Order cities are really quite interesting. It consists of about a dozen or so allied cities. And all of these cities seem to be equals. None of them sort of acknowledge the suzerainty or superiority of any other. And all of these cities seem to be allied with one another, and they all sort of hail their origin back to, acknowledging the overlordship of Siyakak and Teotihuacan. And the foremost of these new cities is the city of Tikal. Tikal is not the capital of the New Order, but it is clearly the largest and wealthiest of these New Order cities. The New Order does not last forever. By this time the 6th century comes, you get into kind of this troubled middle classic, and a lot, if not most, of these New Order cities suffer pretty destructive events in the 6th century. A lot of them are depressed, a lot of them are sort of crushed down. And following the decline of the New Order cities and this sort of hegemony of the New Order cities, arises a new power in the northern section of the southern lowlands. And this is the brand new city of Calakmul. And the city of Calakmul is sort of refounded from a city called Zibanche, which is like to the east. And Calakmul rises up in the north and sort of builds this sort of empire of cities that are attached to it. This sort of alliance building called the Calakmul hegemony. And the Calakmul hegemony consists of a single powerful overking at the city-state of Calakmul. But then the city-state of Calakmul has this imperial policy of marrying off the princesses from this city to its subordinates, to its valuable allies. And it builds this sort of web of marriages that stretches across the Maya lowlands, and especially seems focused on the Great Western Road that we discussed earlier. And the Calakmul hegemony brings it into conflict with the old power of the New Order, which is Tikal. And Calakmul and Tikal engage in a series of bloody rival wars, and this is the period of Tikal resurgent. And that's the 700s. That's when Calakmul and Tikal and all of their respective allies just beat the unholy hell out of each other in a series of awful, destructive wars. And this seems to be wrapped up in the classic Maya collapse. And it is the collapse that really gets started in the middle of the 8th century. And as you get into the 800s and definitely into the 900s, the collapse just proceeds. And it's like a series of dominoes or a house of cards that goes down a little bit at a time and then suddenly all at once. And that is the classic Maya collapse, which is what we're trying to answer right here. Now, like I said, classic Maya politics seems to revolve around the enmity between these two great and powerful cities. There are really two cities in the classic Maya lowlands that are larger, stronger, wealthier, and much more powerful than any of their neighbors. And those two great rivals are Tikal and Calakmul. Tikal, there's the emblem glyph of Tikal there over on the left. Tikal is, of course, the modern name for the site. In fact, that's a picture of Tikal right up above me. Tikal in antiquity, in the classic period, was known as Yashmutul, which translated into English is kind of the city or the place of the precious topknot. And Tikal was constantly at loggerheads and locked in this cycle of unending war with its great rival to the north, the city-state of Calakmul, which in antiquity, Calakmul was known as Khan, which is the kingdom of snake. This is why Tikal gets known as, the kings of Tikal, the kings of Yashmutul, but Calakmul are the kings of the snake and the snake princesses that kind of marry off into all of these dynasties scattered across the classic lowlands. And it is very easy to sort of characterize these cities, and it's very easy to characterize these cities based on kind of Greek analogies. Tikal, that's Tikal right up above me. Tikal is kind of, the image that emerges of Tikal is a city of these beautiful, delicate little slender pyramids. It becomes kind of the city of art, the city of literature, the city of beauty and culture. And, in a kind of analogy with classic Greece, Tikal ends up playing the role of Athens. And as Tikal kind of plays the role of Athens in the Maya lowlands, Calakmul ends up playing the role of Sparta. And Calakmul is this huge city of a few really powerful and impressive, indeed almost spooky pyramids. You go into the plaza of Tikal and everything seems slender and beautiful and pleasing to the eye. You go into the central plaza of Calakmul and everything just looks absolutely terrifying. This huge pyramid they've got at Calakmul is just a statement of imperial power and imperial hegemony. And it's very easy to kind of make that analogy, to paint Tikal as kind of the center of art and learning and culture, and paint Calakmul as this sort of militaristic city full of imperial ambitions. But we don't actually know how accurate that analogy is, even though it's a very easy analogy to make. So, okay, I'm mostly going to talk about the period of Tikal resurgent, and that starts in the middle of the 7th century. So here's the political situation. In sort of the early to middle 7th century, you have the Calakmul hegemony, the realm of Kanul, the city-state of Calakmul. And ruling at Calakmul is their enormous, powerful king, a guy up at the top called Yuknom Chen the Great. And it is Yuknom Chen the Great who expands Calakmul's influence to be its widest. It extends all across that great western road. It extends deep into all the directions of the classic lowlands. While there was never a single ruler of the classic Maya, Yuknom Chen comes as absolutely close as anyone ever came. And he marries off his daughters and his granddaughters to all of his close allies and subordinates, including to El Pruwaka. At any rate, the Calakmul hegemony, in the early 7th century is clearly the predominant power in the classic Maya lowlands. The old city of the new order is Tikal, and Tikal is ruled by a king called Kinich Muan Hol. And Kinich Muan Hol probably dreams of returning Tikal to its days of ascendance, in the days when it was the most powerful and wealthiest city in the old new order. And he passes these ambitions on to his two sons, Nunhol Chak and Hassachan Kawil. And Nunhol Chak wants to take Tikal back to the days of the New Order. And he more or less plans a great kind of rebellion or uprising against Calakmul and against Yuknom Chen the Great, the sort of this old, powerful man who rules the kingdom of Snake. And part of this appears to be sending his younger brother, Hassachan Kawil, to the south. And Hassachan Kawil founds a new city called Dos Pilas. And Hassachan Kawil becomes the ruler of Dos Pilas. And Dos Pilas is situated right on top of that great western road. In other words, it stands as a direct threat to the Calakmul hegemony. And Nunhol Chak is positioning Tikal to lead kind of this uprising or opposition to the Calakmul hegemony. But Yuknom Chen the Great, who must be this really old man, Yuknom Chen the Great basically gets wind of this scheme, and he very rapidly figures out what Nunhol Chak is attempting. And he sends his armies south. But he sends his armies south not to attack Tikal, but to attack Dos Pilas. And his enemies and the armies of Calakmul attack Dos Pilas. They defeat Dos Pilas and capture Hassachan Kawil. And then something really interesting seems to happen in the epigraphic record. Hassachan Kawil is not sacrificed. Hassachan Kawil is not sort of held as a captive for years and years. Hassachan Kawil reappears on the scene, but he reappears attacking his brother. Hassachan Kawil leads armies against his older brother of Nunhol Chak. What Yuknom Chen the Great did was, instead of capturing, enslaving, or sacrificing Hassachan Kawil, he turned him. And Hassachan Kawil ended up betraying his own brother. And he leads the Calakmul hegemony against his own brother. And Nunhol Chak and Hassachan Kawil fight back and forth across the jungle for several years. Nunhol Chak seizes Dos Pilas a couple times, and Hassachan Kawil forces Nunhol Chak out of Tikal at least 2 or 3 times. But Hassachan Kawil seems to have this real military gift. And Yuknom Chen finds in Hassachan Kawil a superlative general and great warrior. And backed by Yuknom Chen the Great, Hassachan Kawil eventually overcomes and captures his brother. Nunhol Chak is defeated and he is dragged back to Calakmul. We do not actually know what happened to Nunhol Chak, but we know that the epigraphy says, if I remember this correctly, after the defeat of Nunhol Chak, heads were piled up and blood pooled on the ground. That's what the Maya glyphs say. So Nunhol Chak is out of it. But then something really interesting happens, because Hassachan Kawil is not made the ruler of Tikal. Another figure appears. One of our main figures, that's going to be him on the lower left, Hassachan Kawil. And Hassachan Kawil is the son of Nunhol Chak and the nephew of Hassachan Kawil. Are you still with me, or are the names coming fast and furious? Because we're going to have a few more people in a bit. Hassachan Kawil inherits sort of this very much diminished Tikal, a Tikal that has known a series of defeats and failures over the last few years. But under the leadership of Hassachan Kawil, he reinvigorates Tikal. He lets Tikal be a threat to his uncle who betrayed his own father. It's kind of like Hamlet in the rainforest. And Hassachan Kawil gathers together sort of the scrappy little armies of Tikal to lead them against the Calakmul hegemony in one last ride. But things have changed back in Calakmul. The old man, Yuknom Chen the Great, is not going to live forever. And he eventually dies. He just dies of old age. He must have been very, very old. And eventually he has a successor. And the successor to Yuknom Chen the Great is Yuknom Yichak Kak. And he's probably the son of Yuknom Chen. And the son of Yuknom Chen, Yuknom Yichik Kak, probably goes south with the Calakmul armies. And they meet in battle. The power of the Calakmul hegemony against this scrappy little army from Hassachan Kawil. And they meet in 695, the year 695. But there's somebody really missing from this big climatic battle in the jungles of Guatemala. And that's Hassachan Kawil. Hassachan Kawil is absent this entire time, despite the fact he was very active in the defeat of his own brother and in the defeat of his own home city. That when the final showdown between Calakmul and Tikal comes in 695, Hassachan Kawil is not to be found. And this has led to a lot of speculation. Nobody really knows what happened. I've heard a lot of speculation, generally sitting around bars late at night. Some scholars think that Hassachan Kawil was very upset at not being given the city of Tikal, and that he eventually betrayed Yuknom Ichak Kak, and he literally did not show up with his army like he was supposed to. Other scholars think that some kind of deal got worked out between Hassachan Kawil and his uncle, the same uncle that murdered his father, and that Hassachan Kawil promised Hassachan Kawil that he could keep Das Pilas, but he's got to stay out of the war. Maybe, we don't know. But all we do know is that Yuknom Ichak Kak meets Hassachan Kawil in open battle in 695 and absolutely loses everything. The Calakmul hegemony is utterly and completely smashed. Hassachan Kawil is completely and totally victorious. And with that 695 victory, sort of the great ambitions of Calakmul to unite all of the Maya lowlands ends forever. And with Hassachan Kawil's 695 victory, Tikal reemerges as one of the great Maya cities and the principal rival to Calakmul in the north. And throughout the next century, something really interesting happens. Throughout the next century, as Hassachan Kawil's, sons rule, and as Tikal proceeds to launch a series of wars against the allies of Calakmul, they don't really launch wars against Das Pilas. And that there seems to be, an agreement between Tikal and Das Pilas. They use the same emblem glyph, among other things. It's very strange. But Hassachan Kawil spends the rest of his life ruling this tiny little predatory kingdom of Das Pilas in the south. And he eventually passes on the kingdom to Itzamnach Kawil, to his own son. And again, completely content to rule their own tiny little kingdom in the south. And they don't really seem to get pulled in to these really big wars between Tikal and Calakmul in the north. And exactly what happened during that whole thing, we don't really know. We either haven't found the records, or the events were never recorded, or it was a secret agreement. I'm not going to give you my own speculation, but I have them. But the victory of Hassachan Kawil did apparently come at some kind of cost. And we have this really unusual monument at Tikal, which is Tikal Altar 5. There's a drawing of it right up above my head, and right over there you can see an image of it. And Tikal Altar 5 is a really unusual altar. It's one of the few images in which a Tikal king shares a central scene with a subordinate. And what it appears to show is two figures, one of whom is Hassachan Kawil, kneeling over a pile of bones. And this is basically, it is commemorating the funeral of an individual that is likely the wife of Hassachan Kawil. And she is reburied in the year 711. And a number of different interpretations of this monument have been published over the years. But the most likely one to me is that in the middle of all of this fighting and in the middle of this uprising against Calakmul, one of the casualties of these war was the Queen of Tikal herself. And she died at some point in time, and they couldn't retrieve her body, or she had to be secretly buried in a hurry. And later, after these wars begin to calm down, and after the power of Tikal is assured, Hassachan Kawil digs her up and gives her a formal state funeral at Tikal. But of course, by then, she's nothing but bones. So, I mean, this is a good example of exactly how we know that these events occurred in the epigraphic record, but they're just points on a continuum. And all these other arguments and these historical narratives have to be woven around what is a handful of data points. And speculation runs rampant. There's nothing wrong with speculation as long as you admit that you're speculating. At any rate, Tikal's 695 victory over Calakmul Mul marks a dramatic upturn in militarism across the classic lowlands. Over the next 100 years, Tikal and her allies are continually attacking Calakmul Mul and her allies. As Tikal basically proceeds to dismantle war by war, it just takes the Calakmul Mul hegemony apart. And we have these images, like on this ceramic vase right up above me, of warriors in their regalia going off to war. And they are continually launching not just more wars, but more destructive wars. And a particular type of destructive war that is called a star war. And as the old Calakmul Mul hegemony disintegrates, these star war events multiply between the different classic city-states. And if you look at those glyphs right over there, those are glyphs indicating a star war has taken place. So what is a star war exactly? Okay, a star war appears to be a uniquely destructive military event. That is a war in which you are fighting not to seize a captive or to capture a king or to fight over a forest or a river. But the purpose of a star war appears to be the capture and destruction of an enemy city. You fight a star war to inflict maximum death and destruction on your enemies. And one of the reasons that the star war one of the reasons it's called a star war is the top part of that glyph is the image of the morning star and the evening star, the stellar object that we call the planet Venus. So these wars are being blessed by one of the hero twins. They're being blessed by sort of these cosmic bodies in the sky itself, that they're using their astronomical calendar to predict the best time to launch wars, to inflict maximum amounts of death and destruction on their enemy. And one of the things that's invigorating their soldiers as they go forth is the knowledge that the gods themselves and the spirits themselves and the stars in the sky have sanctified the death and destruction of this military conflict. Here's an example of one of these. We have this lintel from Tikal. And in this lintel at Tikal, the central figure is the ruler of Tikal, Hassachan Kawil. And he's the son of Hassachan Kawil, from our previous story. And one of the historical events that's recorded on this lintel is the great defeat of one of their enemies, the primary subordinate ally of Calakmul Mul herself. And that city is El Peru Waka. That's where I work. And El Peru Waka apparently went to war with Tikal in the year 743 and is incredibly defeated. Tikal defeats El Peru Waka, and apparently they fought this battle. It was apparently located at some distance from any city because they don't really seem to have captured El Peru Waka itself. But they did defeat the armies of El Peru Waka. They did capture the king, and they did capture one of the patron gods of the city itself. These are all captured. It's this tremendous defeat. A scholar called Gerardo Aldana has sort of tabulated the occurrence of these really destructive star wars. And he published this in an article in 2005. So here, if you look at that table up at the top, that's from his 2005 study of the timing of these star war events. And I'm showing you this to show you how these wars and how these really destructive, cosmologically blessed events are sort of multiplying across the classic Maya lowlands. Of the 27 known Star War events, 15 of them occur between the years 705 and 808. So basically, Hassachan Kawil defeats Calakmul Mul, and then it seems to just unleash this wave of destructive war across the classic lowlands. More than 55% of all known Star Wars events take place in the 100 years after the defeat of Kalak Mul, this single 103-year period. And that is in a tradition of epigraphic history that's 1,700 years long. So, but I do need to temper that. I do want to temper that in one way. It might just be fashionable to describe wars in this manner. It might just be the epigraphic record mentioning warfare more often. But I think the most likely interpretation of this is there's just a lot more war going on. There are Star Wars in the jungle. And proving that truth is in fact stranger than fiction. Long before any of this epigraphy was deciphered, long before they broke the Maya code, the movie Star Wars was filmed at Tikal. This is a still from the original 1977 Star Wars. And right before like the X-Wings fly off to go blow up the Death Star, they fly over the pyramids of Tikal. So there really were Star Wars in the jungle because there was Star Wars in the jungle. And there's a lot of evidence that supports this idea that there's this increased wave of militarism across the classic lowlands. There is archaeological and epigraphic evidence that supports this sharp uptick in military violence. What we have is throughout the 8th century, throughout the 700s, wars become much more frequent. The art becomes much more militaristic. You have more images like that than you have images of sort of dancing hero twins. So basically, wars become mentioned more often. The art itself becomes more militant. Wars and battles are mentioned with greater frequency in the monumental history. Right up above me is a lintel from a place called Yaxchilan. That's Yaxchilan Lintel 10. And I want you to look at that image right up above me and note how the glyphs get smaller as you move to the right side of the monument. And what's happening is, as they're carving the monument, as they're recording these wars, there are more wars taking place than there is space left on the monument to mention them. And as the wars become more frequent, the glyphs get smaller because they got to cram it in on the right side. That they are basically running out of space to record all of the military adventures and all of the warfare that's taking place, as Yaxchilan is sort of fighting for its life in the middle of all these Star Wars events. And it's not just epigraphy that seems to be supporting this idea that there is this increase in militarism. Archaeological evidence seems to confirm the epigraphic history. Here is the site of Canquen in the south. It was the southern anchor of that sort of great western road. And at the site of Canquen, somebody at some point in time overran the city center. They captured the city. And apparently what they did is they gathered together the entire royal family. They gathered together the entire royal court and killed every single one of them. They butcher this entire family. Men, women, children, retainers, servants, generals, all of them. They kill an entire royal family. They kill an entire court and pile their bodies into one of the reflecting pools in front of the main temple. So far from this mass grave, at least 24 individuals have been recovered. They actually had to bring in specialists from like the Guatemalan Civil War, from forensic experts who are used to mass graves to uncouple like all of these bodies just piled one on top of the other. It's an absolutely horrifying scene. And one of the things we've noticed at the site of El Peruaca, where I work, is that there is a big uptick in human sacrifices taking place in the 8th century. In the 8th century at El Peruaca, we only have about 8 sort of known human sacrifices, and almost all of them are in the 700s. And I've excavated at least 4 human sacrifices. And here's maps of 3 of mine. Right up above me, there is burial 18 and 19. These are 2 individuals they basically had a huge feast to dedicate the construction of a palace. They had a huge feast. They smashed the remains of their feast, and then they sacrificed 2 people on the remains of the feast, feeding their souls into the building itself. Yeah, and they buried them underneath a staircase. you can see that kind of very unnatural angle of the burial 19 individual right up above me. And probably one of the more terrifying burials I've ever excavated is there on the left. That's El Peru Waka burial 64. And oh, that's absolutely awful. It is again placed underneath the staircase. And what they apparently did in this case is they decapitated an individual, cut off his arms and legs, and piled the arms and legs in a stack, placed the head in a bowl on top, and then while the head still had flesh on it, this is probably a peri-mortem injury, they took a stone slab and smashed it into the skull. And you can see the sort of shattered skull. And I've seen peri-mortem injuries. I used to work in a forensics lab. If that skull would have been dry bone, or this person would have been dead for a long time, when that limestone slab was smashed into it, it would have shattered, or it would have broken really dramatically. But no, you can clearly tell that the bone bent before it broke. So the skull was still fleshed when they smashed a limestone slab into it. And you can see on the upper left, that piece of art, these are captives in warfare being brought forth and presented to a lord. They may be to be given out as sacrifice, maybe ransomed back, who knows. But basically this increase in human sacrifice, I would argue, is another indicator that there are a lot of wars going on. People are being taken captive, people are being sacrificed, people are being decapitated and having their heads smashed open with limestone slabs. Things are getting very, very scary in the classic Maya lowlands. Now, Arthur Demarest, together with Nicholas Dunning and another scholar called Madomansky, has basically characterized this new world of intensive warfare and captive taking as a landscape of fear. And they basically argued that the normal rules of warfare are breaking down in the 8th century. And where before you would fight over rivers, or you would fight over trade routes, or you would fight to establish some sort of power over another city. But in the 8th century, you are fighting to kill enemies. You are fighting to burn cities. You are fighting to destroy your enemies. And the old rules of warfare are gone. And the normal rules are obsolete, and these new warfare emerge. This new rules of warfare emerge, where you have the Maya lowlands being populated by human predators seeking prey. People are hunting each other in the jungle, and they are looking to attack and destroy these powerful Maya cities. Now it's time to think. I want you to write down that question in the upper left. I want you to cogitate an answer, because I'm going to ask you a question. Remember our discussion of these big Maya cities. Big cities, dispersed, low-density cities, a mix of city and residence and forest and cornfield all mixed together. They would have looked like that. What's going to happen to these big, dispersed cities when the landscape of fear comes? How are you going to maintain a city that covers, 10 square kilometers, 20 square kilometers, when there's armies all around you, when there's armed bands of roving men looking to take prisoners, when there are huge armies on the march, moving not just to capture your city, but to kill it? How do you defend a huge, low-density city? And the answer seems to be with great difficulty. Cities began to try and defend themselves. Fortifications began to appear on a large scale. Tikal itself appears to have built a partial wall. You can see the map to the left. They build a line of earthworks across the northern edge of this huge dispersed city. And they even build a series of earthworks on the southeastern edge as well. And the exact nature of these earthworks has been very heavily debated over time. There's some indications that they might have been repurposed canals. They might have originally started out not as earthworks at all, but as hydraulic devices, as canals that were then repurposed into defensive earthworks. They may be repairing much older defensive structures. A lot of people said these can't be city walls because they're not complete, and that's I don't think that's the right way to see it, because you know your wall, you don't depend entirely on your walls. You use your walls to guard your weak spaces and then put your armies where you're strong. So they are making an attempt to defend this huge sprawling city, but it does not seem to have worked. The cities began to die one by one, even though some of them really resist the dying of the light. And here we have the city of Dos Pilas, the old city of Hassachan Kawil and its Hassachan Kawil. And in these drawings, these really excellent drawings from National Geographic, we have two very different images of the city center. The image at the top, that is Dos Pilas in its glory days, in the days of its Hassachan Kawil and Hassachan Kawil, the city in its glory. We've got a central plaza, we have temple pyramids, we have palaces, we have marketplaces, we have a vibrant, powerful, living city. But that is a very, very different place towards the end. What seems to happen with Dos Pilas in the end is the last people, the final population of Dos Pilas, lives in that city, the second drawing. They seem to have moved into the center of their own city. They seem to have moved into the plaza and then ripped the stones off the sides of their own holy pyramids to hastily build a series of concentric walls around the final holdout of the people of Dos Pilas. Temple and palaces were torn down to build walls, to build great houses. They took refuge in the final center of their own dying city. And a lot of these fortifications do not seem to work. Here is another classic Maya city, the city of Aguateca. It was constructed on one side of a great ravine, and they thought that the ravine would protect them just like city walls. It did not. And the entire city was stormed around the year 800. Somebody stormed into the city, killed the people who lived there, and burned that city to the ground. That a lot of these fortifications do not seem to have worked, and the landscape of fear appears to have ruled unchallenged. So to survive, the remaining cities became quite small. They became quite dense. They had to highly nucleate and live behind high fortified walls because the landscape itself was simply too dangerous. And I'm going to ask you another one of my questions. In fact, I'm going to ask you two questions real quick. One, what is the problem in terms of the environment about living in sort of a concentrated, nucleated, fortified city, especially in a rainforest environment where you can't spread your population out because it's too dangerous? What you're going to have to do is concentrate your population in a tiny footprint, boom, in the middle of the rainforest, and then intensively farm all around that fortified center. What is likely to happen to those concentrated, nucleated, fortified cities? And here's the second question. What would a landscape of fear do to that complex, highly commercialized system that we described earlier? The system that's portrayed in the map on the left. Again, one of the key ecological adaptations of classic Maya civilization was that system of interlinked markets, that system that made it possible for merchants, porters, and rulers to move food from areas of surplus to areas of scarcity and sell it at tremendous profit. In other words, they can move food around a system to alleviate any localized disaster. But once the landscape becomes too difficult to travel across, what's going to happen to all those interlinked markets? What's going to happen to this key ecological adaptation developed by these classic Maya city-states? One possibility of what exactly happens is, again, in the ceramic data, which is to say those ceramic spheres that I described in the other lecture, the ceramic spheres collapse. You no longer have these huge open ceramic spheres with a dozen different cities sharing nearly identical ceramics. Sharing sharing the same thing. And you go from very, very high quality ceramics to very, very low quality ceramics. The overall quality of ceramic production declines as these ceramic spheres collapse and as this economy seems to completely unravel in the face of increased militarism and a landscape of fear. Cogitate on the question that's right above my yellow box. Why would the end of a complex economy be a severe problem for living in a rainforest biome? Now, war's bad, all right? Everybody knows this. Nobody's going to argue that. But the question is, can warfare destroy a civilization? Well, the history of Europe is intensely bloody. And we know that the great wars of Europe produced many of the same effects that we can see in the archaeological record of the classic Maya. We see devastated lands, we see large-scale depopulation of areas, we see fortification, massacre, famine, death, and destruction. And, you know, European history is absolutely bloody with this stuff. And examples of all of the above can be found in the exceptionally ugly military conflicts from European history, especially the really bad ones, the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, that they had these massive, massive destructive wars. But the thing with Europe, the difference between Europe and the classic Maya, is Europe bounced back from these conflicts. The 30 Years' War probably killed 1 out of every 3 people in Central Europe. I mean, it just devastated Germany for almost 100 years. The 100 Years' War utterly smashed France for an incredibly long period of time, and it bankrupted England. But, you know, here's the key. Here's one of the questions that you should ask yourself. What's different? Why did Europe, you know, it took generations, but why did Europe bounce back from these incredibly destructive wars? Why didn't the classic Maya bounce back from these incredibly destructive military events? What is different about the classic Maya? Why couldn't they come back from these incredibly horrific wars of the 8th century? Now, before I leave this, there is one other possibility. In the early 21st century, a series of arguments emerged using sort of riverine systems and sediment analysis and speleothem data. And basically it argued that during the 8th century, what you have is these series of great Maya droughts. And these huge droughts covered the land. And that maybe it was this scarcity of water and the lack of rainfall and a increased aridity that triggered all of these classic wars, that these classic wars weren't purely a product of the political and the military situation of the time, but rather severe droughts were increasing militarism among these classic city-states. I am very, very skeptical of the drought hypothesis. I think a lot of the data is being presented as being far more secure than it actually is. I think a lot of the data is specious, and I question the reason that data that supports this idea is often presented where data that contradicts it is quietly buried. But you know what? I am not omniscient. I could be wrong. It is very, very likely that I could easily be wrong on this. So I do want to mention that this is an idea, the idea that you have these great and terrible droughts that are fueling these wars and that are killing these cities. I'm skeptical of it, but it could be true. It could end up being accurate, that it is the drought that's causing the wars, and that it is the war and the drought that's killing the cities. Maybe. At any rate, by AD 1000, it is almost entirely over. In the southern Maya lowlands, the great cities are gone. They are being slowly recolonized by the jungle. The once teeming residences are now empty. Only, birds, parrots, and spider monkeys inhabit the great palaces of kings and queens. Now, they are replaced by a series of cities in the north, in sort of the terminal classic and into the post-classic period. But for the greater part of the Maya world, classical civilization has absolutely collapsed, and it is gone, never to rise again. It's the end of a world. And now you have all of the information you need to build an answer, even a partial one, to that question right there. And this question should be very familiar to you by now. And the question is, the classic Maya maintained a sustainable settlement of the tropical rainforest for 1,000 years. Then, in the 8th and 9th century, this ecological balance unraveled. The question here is, what seems to have happened in this collapse? How did an environmental balance become so upset that an entire civilization failed within 200 years? You have all the information you need to build an answer to that question. And this brings us to an end to Module 12. It brings us to an end of our section on the classic Maya. The only thing left is the final exam itself. And I will see you there. Something smells.